Hello and welcome. My name's Paul Frost and I'm the chairperson of Mansfield Old Meeting House. To give it its full title, Mansfield Old Meeting House, Unitarian Free Christian Church. Above us you see the porch of the Old Meeting House, and today I'll be giving you a tour of the chapel with some notes about its history. This porch is one of the newer elements of the church. It was put in 1940 in memory of the wife of John Harrop White, who was a leading person in the town, town clerk, and he was a major benefactor and supporter of the chapel. So we see here a quote from the Psalm 100, and then inside, when we go into the porch, there's an inscription to Agnes, who was John Harrop White's wife. So if you follow me, we'll go in. The chapel has a long history. We'll talk about that. The story starts in about 1662 on this site, and then there are various changes through the history of England, and we'll talk about that and what those changes meant for this chapel and how itself changed. So we'll take you into the porch and we'll have a look in there. Now we're in the porch of the Old Meeting House. As I say, this was put in 1940. There are two doors here. Originally, doors were in another part of the chapel, but the doors that they replaced here were old Victorian Gothic doors on the front of the chapel, which didn't really fit in with the building. You might say that this fits in a little better, but there are those who say even this porch doesn't fit with the exterior appearance of the chapel. In here you can see a number of plaques. We have our war memorials for the 1914 to 1918 war, with members of the chapel on both sides of the porch who died as a result of that war. And down at the bottom there we have the 5 members of the chapel who died in the 1939 to 1945 World War II. We also have lists of the ministers of the chapel, starting there with Robert Porter in 1666, right through to our current minister, the Reverend Maria Papp, on the other side of the porch. These boards were donated in memory of John Harrop White. As you see there, we have the arms of the local Freemasons. He was a Freemason, and also the arms of the town. As you say, he was a leading member of the town. So listed there are all the ministers of the chapel. What we'll do now, above me here, is the inscription, as I say, to Agnes Mary Harrop White. Some people say this was our miniature version of the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal was erected as a memorial, and this similarly was erected as a memorial. We'll now move into the chapel and I'll show you the main body of the chapel. This is the Old Meeting House. I'll just give you time to have a look around. You'll see that we have a very interesting chapel, but it didn't look like this to start with, and I'll talk about that with you. We'll start at the back with some of the windows. There's some very interesting windows, and these windows here lead on. These were put in, the first windows were put in 1951. And on one side we have St. Matthew and St. John, and on the other hand we have St. Luke and St. Mark. These windows, as I say, were put in 1951, and they are, again, commemorative windows. The one that you're now looking at was in memory of Harold Royce. Harold Royce was someone who was involved with the Mansfield Shoe Company, which was a major employer in the area. And again, those were put in there in memory of Harold Royce. So, if we look at the chapel from this viewpoint, you can start to get an idea of the evolution of this building. If you imagine that the chancel there was just a wall, there was no chancel there at one stage, you can get an idea of what this room originally looked like. If we look over to the windows on the far side, on the either sides of the commemorative tablets, you will see where the doors were. These were the original doors. Over them would have been a balcony for musicians, and then in here was a simple English Presbyterian meeting house with simple pews. Facing this wall, at this wall there would be a pulpit. In the English Presbyterian tradition, the sermon was and still remains really important, and there you would have the altar table in front, the communion table in front, and gathered round the pews and chairs where people would sit. Very simple building. None of these oak pews, none of the panelling, none of the windows would have just been simple glass. A very simple, plain meeting house where people met to worship. So what happened to turn it into what it is today? We'll go through that interesting history. As we move down the chapel, you can see here a memorial to Mary Letitia, the wife of Reverend A.W. Worthington. He was the minister from 1858 to 1879. It also commemorates the minister at the bottom, and he was the minister during the major restoration of this chapel. At that time, there were a number of important and wealthy people in the town involved in the chapel. We've already mentioned John Harrop White, and the status, they felt that the interior of the building should reflect the status the chapel had in the town, in terms of the people that were involved in it, and they turned the chapel and added the chancel. They also added panelling, and it began to look more like an Anglican parish church, which is what it looks like now. It looks more like the Church of England established church, as you would expect to see, with a choir, a chancel, and various different other aspects facing that way in a more conventional manner. So, moving down the chapel, we'll look at these windows. On our right and left, we see these interesting windows. We mentioned John Harrop White. This one here was put in 1928, and again erected by Harrop and Agnes White. This is a William Morris Company window, and based on designs by by Burne-Jones, Sir Edward Burne-Jones, and between the two windows here we have another Morris and Company window. You can identify them by that the floral design, and in between them you have a memorial to Reverend John Williams, who was a 19th century pastor of the congregation, whose daughter was quite a well-known poet, in one of the Sherwood Forest poets. Over here you have another Morris and Company window, erected to the memory of William Austin Valence, another important family in the town. And in between that and the next window, you have the memorial tablets that were erected on anniversaries of the chapel. The top one was erected by members of the Old Meeting House following a Thanksgiving service held on 20th of May 1962 to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the events which led to the founding of the congregation. And then the second tablet was erected to commemorate 300 years of the building of the Old Meeting House. And when we get to the altar table and the plaque there, I will talk more about the history, the original history. But from that you can see that the congregation was founded in 1662, and that was due to the ejection of ministers from the Church of England. The Presbyterian and more Protestant ministers were ejected with the restoration of the monarchy after the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period, and they were thrown out of the Church of England, and they went to places where they could gather together. Certain towns, like Mansfield, were more amenable to that. They weren't as likely to be prosecuted here. The existing Church of England vicar, who was allowed to stay in the parish church here, was more sympathetic to them. He hadn't been kicked out. So they had a bit of a sanctuary here. So a number of ministers came and lived in Mansfield and then worshipped together in the way that they saw as right and fitting in the old house at the bottom, which is now our parsonage building. We don't use it as a parsonage, it is now rented out for commercial use, but there is a building at the bottom where they originally met. And then, following the acts of toleration and various different changes over the years, more freedom was allowed in worship, and those ministers could return either to their livings or to their places where they lived previously. But Robert Porter and one or two others stayed here and set up the meeting house, and this building was built in 1702, was erected and opened in 1702. So, moving down the building again, if we look over there, you can see an Act of Parliament clock. At one stage, it was declared in England that you needed to have clocks in public spaces, and this is one of the Act of Parliament clocks. At one stage there was a clock tax, so people had clocks taxed if they had them. Therefore it was very important to be able to set your watch, your fob watch or whatever, from a clock. And this is one of the Act of Parliament clocks that it was decreed should be in public places for people to set their watches by. It's believed to date from the early 1740s, and it bears the name of Norwich next to that of its maker, Thomas Haley, who's known to have moved to London about 1745. It's somewhat changed and is believed to have surmounted by 3 decorative balls originally. In 1942 the weight fell out and damaged the pews underneath. This is believed to have happened more than once, but it has survived, it's there. Moving on to the next window. This is an interesting window which was erected by the bequest of Mary Mallatrat, widow of George Mallatrat. They ran a public house in the town, one of the most successful public houses. It's still there. It's currently a bank building. It's quite an impressive building, but it was a big public house in the town. And when she died, passed away, she left a bequest. Amongst the specifications of that was that every Good Friday we would hold a donation of hot cross buns to the local poor children. And that went on ever since the date that it came in. George Mallatrat was 1844 to 1991. Sorry, 1891. Since that time, we have tried, obviously difficult this year with the COVID-19 restrictions, to do that, but that is a tradition that has continued since then. Moving forward, we see the organ. It's now an electronic organ. It was originally a pipe organ, but it's an electronic organ we have now. And down here we have the piano. The piano was donated by Frank Warsop, who was a councillor of the town. And there's a plaque to Frank Warsop on the wall there. Frank Warsop, important person in the history of the meeting house, because in common with a lot of places in England in the 1970s, there was lots of urban development. Not all wise, and a lot of it very destructive. Lots of things were concreted over, and they decided to put an inner ring road into Mansfield. That inner ring road, when it was planned, was to go straight through this site and demolish this building. Frank Warsock, being a councillor, argued very long and very hard that that should not happen, that this is an important building in the town. We'd lost the Quaker Meeting House, which played a really important part in the development of the whole Quaker denomination. We didn't really need to lose this meeting house, which is the oldest non-conformist place of worship in the county. So we didn't want to lose it, and Frank Warsock fought for us, and it's still here today. If you look at the ring road now, the inner ring road, it actually has a bend in it, a kink in it. That is the old meeting house bend and kink, whereby they go by us and they don't demolish the building. So, turning to the back wall. We have here 2 more stained glass windows with representations above the left-hand choir stalls of Jesus as the sower and the Good Shepherd, the carpenter's son and the one having authority, and this was the gift by bequest of the previously mentioned George Mallatrat of Stockwell Gate. Behind the communion table, we have angels and we have panels, and the tiling and other decoration behind the communion table date to 1890. The zinc plates here have quotes from John chapter 5 verse 24 and chapter 17 verse 3 and Mark chapter 12 verses 29 to 31. Beneath them is a plaque dedicated to the founders of the congregation, the Commonwealth clergy who refused to conform at the Restoration and gathered in Mansfield as a place of safety. The window to the right shows St. Peter with the keys to the kingdom and St. Paul with the martyr's sword. It was installed in March 1890 at the same time as the second wave of major 19th century building work, and this was the gift of John Burks of Lime Tree Place, Mansfield, who died on the 15th of September 1890, age 90. Interestingly, St. Peter and St. Paul are the patron saints of the parish church of Mansfield. So again, we can see that not only did we kind of replicate some of the appearance of the parish church of Mansfield at that time, it also installed a window at that time with the patron saints of the local parish church. To the right is the minister's vestry. You'll recall that before 1908, there was further development before 1908, this is where the organ stood, but it was switched to the other side. Returning down the steps to the main body of the church, we have a brass eagle lectern. The brass eagle lectern was given to the congregation in memory of William Hollins of Plesley Vale. Hollins was a distinguished benefactor of the old meeting house, and his family was important in the development of the textile industry. He's buried in the parish church in Plesley near Mansfield, and there is a memorial stone tablet to him and his wife on the wall nearby. By the wall in front of the pulpit is our Book of Remembrance. At every service we have a reading of the Book of Remembrance of members of the congregation who have passed on, and we also have above that a window with images representing faith, hope and charity, bearing a lamp, anchor and garments for ragged children respectively. This was dedicated to the memory of Robert Frank Valance, who died on the 18th of April 1908. It was given by his daughter, brother and sisters, and was designed by Gascoigne & Co. of Nottingham. The next window shows Elizabeth with her son, the infant John the Baptist, meeting Mary, Joseph and the infant Jesus. It's dedicated to George Valance, who died on the 30th of May 1880, and his wife Mary Valance, who died on the 13th of June 1890. It was given by their two youngest children, Arthur Clayton Valence and Maud Mary Valence. Turning to the corner of the chapel, is a plaque commemorating Alice Olga Toulmin Vaughan, dearly beloved wife of Frank Hemming Vaughan, minister of the chapel and only child of Arthur Toulmin Smith of Moscow, born March the 27th, 1882, and died January 1911. The tablet was given by the congregation. Frank Hemming Vaughan was minister from 1906 to 1912. He was a William Blake enthusiast and scholar, very interesting person. We had quite a number of ministers who wrote, Frank Hemming Vaughan being one of them. Another of our ministers was a popular novelist known by the pseudonym Ben Bolt. His name was Otwell Binns. So, thank you very much for coming along with us. I'll show you the way out, and there are interesting things on our way out as well. As we leave, it's worthwhile looking at the panelling of the chapel. The oak dado and panelling around the doors are put in at the expense of William Hollins. Unfortunately, he died before it was completed. William Hollins, as we say, who was the industrialist of Plesley Vale, very important in the development of the textile industry locally. You may have heard of Coates Viella. That was something which originated from Hollins and his industry. All this was completed under supervision of this architect T. Lock Worthington of London. He was a nephew of the minister, the Reverend Alfred Worthington that we already mentioned. The contractor was Mr. Charles Valence, and as you've seen, Valences were involved in the church as well. He wanted to use oak the same age as the rest of the church, so he used wood dating from 1587 from a disused windmill at Skerry Hill in Mansfield. So the wood, the panelling, is some of the oldest wood in the chapel. Beside the left-hand door, as you face it, are two green man faces. This is an ancient pagan fertility symbol, often found carved in medieval churches. So again, we're harking back to a medieval rural Anglican parish church, which this is not. It's a non-conformist meeting house. But it's interesting to see these here, somewhat unexpected in a non-conformist meeting house. At the back of the church we have a table which cleared for COVID regulations, but normally we have our leaflets and information. And I'll give you a chance to have a look again at the chapel, again with the pillars. Thank you very much for listening to the tour, and please let us know through our Facebook or other ways of communicating with us if you have any questions or anything that you would like to know more about. We're very proud to be custodians of this historic place, and we find the history very interesting, but obviously the church is its people, and we're happy to say that we continue our witness and our worship in Mansfield after 320 years, or even longer if we're counting the period when the congregation was found and not just the building. Thank you very much. Goodbye.